Nasser had committed an act of war by closing the Straits of Tiran. Gradually, the ring tightened around Israel, with incidents flaring up on her various borders. Over 250,000 troops ringed Israel in battle positions, with some 2,000 tanks and over 500 first-line jet aircraft ready to strike. And then, the morning of June the 5th, 1967, saw a handful of young pilots of the Israel Air Force, born out of the Citizens Defense Army, which Israel had created over the years with such care and effectiveness, fight and win what was possibly one of the most brilliant air battles in the history of air warfare. In 3 hours, one morning in June, the Israel Air Force smashed Arab air power and made possible the victory which was to astound the world. In addition to the abundance of equipment and materiel which fell into the hands of the Israel Defense Forces during the Six-Day War, considerable quantities of documents were taken, including operation orders of the Egyptian Eastern Air Command, which detailed the missions of the Egyptian Air Force against Israel. These top-secret orders call for attacks on airfields and civilian objectives in all parts of Israel, including the cutting off of Eilat and the southern Negev from the State of Israel. Other spoils of war include Egyptian newsreels and training films. They portray in training their concept of a very obliging, fleeing, and defeated Israeli enemy. Thus was the war to come visualized by the Egyptian army. But these flights of imagination were not limited solely to the Egyptian cinema screens. The news of war descended also on Egypt's artists. Thus did their fertile imagination depict the approaching victory. But reality and dreams do not always coincide.
But, according to General Herzog, the Arabs were anticipating victory without considering the skill of the young Israeli pilots. The passing out parades for these pilots, Israel's first line of defense, are occasions not only of personal, but also of national importance. At this ceremony, soon after the June War, there was a young man who had been on the other front line as war approached, a kibbutz on the Syrian border. General Herzog tells the boys' story.
But a few weeks ago, he went to work as usual in the morning with his armored tractor to plow the fields on the Syrian frontier under the menacing guns of the overlooking Syrian positions. Then fire was opened from the Syrian heights, but he continued plowing. For an hour and a half, he plowed under fire with artillery and mortar shells doing their share of plowing the field. His tractor was hit, but he refused to abandon it. Meanwhile, the shelling intensified, and as it switched to the village, battle was joined and the members of the kibbutz took shelter. This time it seems longer than usual. The Syrians appear to be making a special effort today. These children are by now used to this form of existence. Indeed, many of them have never known otherwise in their lives. Suddenly, a new sound is heard above. The Israel Air Force intervenes and shoots down 6 Syrian MiG. Mission accomplished. For years, this was the scene which greeted settlers along the Syrian border as they emerged from their shelters.
Which we give its importance.
Nasser exhorts the Arab world to war and to the destruction of Israel.
It's not a problem of the Straits of Iran. It's not the problem of the withdrawal of the international emergency forces. These are all incidents that have risen up but belong to a greater problem. That is the problem of the aggression that has fallen and whose effect is still continuing on a nation of the Arab world in Palestine.
The ring tightens around beleaguered Israel as military pacts are signed with Jordan and Iraq. A contingent from the Kuwait army is reviewed by the ruler of Kuwait as it embarks for Egypt. On May the 22nd, 1967, Nasser, visiting his pilots in Sinai, declares war in effect by announcing the closing of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. But the Egyptians are not the only pilots in the Middle East. A rising wave of hysteria engulfs the Arab world as its leaders fan the flames of hate. Once again, these leaders are the prisoners of their own slogans. Ahmed Shukeri, one of the Palestinian Arab leaders who have brought on the tragedy of their people, incites his followers to war, to murder, to destroy, to massacre. But Israel is ready, as the Israel Defense Forces are quietly and efficiently mobilized and are prepared for any contingency. Years of planning and training have achieved the highly developed teamwork which characterizes Israel's citizen army. Meanwhile, the Egyptian force in the Sinai Desert grows as its units are readied for the move against Israel. Their previously prepared positions, based on Soviet expert advice, are manned by infantry and armor, which move into position. At home, Arab hysteria rises to a crescendo. The tide of war approaches. Waiting, waiting. Then suddenly, on the morning of June the 5th, These are the original shots taken by the gun cameras during the attacks on the Arab airfields. Not all the Arab planes were destroyed on the ground. Some managed to take off. A MiG-21 goes into battle and a series of dogfights ensues. Once again, the actual aerial combat shots taken by the Israeli gun cameras. An elusive customer. The victory roll of the returning aircraft gives Israel its first indication of a great victory. A quick exchange of impressions in between combat missions during the actual fighting. Some failed to return, others barely returned. But even the most severely damaged planes were repaired and were in the air again in record time. These 3 fateful hours resulted in the almost total destruction of the air forces of Egypt, Syria and Jordan, and losses to the Iraqi Air Force. 452 aircraft were destroyed in attacks on some 26 airfields. Of these, 61 aircraft were shot down in air combat. The much vaunted Arab air power lay in smoking ruin. The road to victory was open.